Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are tackling some really heavy strategic material. We're looking at the November 2025 National Security Strategy of the United States. And you asked us to really cut through the noise to find the hard facts about the U.S. strategy toward Latin America. We're talking about the big players, Mexico, Brazil.
And we have to do this through one specific lens, right?
Yeah.
The competition with China. That relationship, that competition, it really dictates almost every single paragraph in this new NSS.
So that's our mission. We're going to try to understand how this global strategic battle maps onto the Western Hemisphere. But before we dive in, the NSS itself, it declares a massive strategic shift right from the get-go.
It really does. This document just flat out rejects previous strategies, calls them, I think the phrase is laundry lists of wishes.
Right.
This NSS, by contrast, defined itself as a concrete, realistic plan, one that has to connect ends to means.
Okay, what does that actually mean in practice?
It means policy goals are only set if the resources, the money, the military assets, the diplomatic capital, are actually available to get it done. It's a call for strategic discipline.
So if it's not a laundry list, what are the philosophical principles guiding this new discipline? The document seems pretty forceful about them.
Oh, it's unapologetic. The whole strategy is built on 4 key pillars. First is America first.
Meaning core national interests always come before international obligations.
Exactly. Second is peace through strength. The idea that a robust deterrence is, the cheapest form of defense.
But the two that really jumped out at me are the ones that dictate how the U.S. will actually engage with other countries.
Yes. Those are flexible realism and a predisposition to non-interventionism.
Let's break those down. Flexible realism.
Well, it means the U.S. is going to be realistic about what it can achieve. It's going to prioritize stable outcomes, secure supply chains, over what the document calls impossible goals of imposed social change.
So in practice, that could mean partnering with a government the U.S. doesn't really align with politically.
As long as that government offers stable trade and, say, border security, yes.
Wow. That is a huge departure from decades of American policy. I mean, promoting democracy was often a prerequisite for partnership.
They're decoupling those priorities, and that ties right into the predisposition to non-interventionism. It basically sets an incredibly high bar for any kind of military or diplomatic intervention.
So only when core national interests are directly threatened.
Directly threatened, it signals a major retreat from routine foreign nation building.
Okay, so let's start where the NSS starts, the primary battleground, the Indo-Pacific Asia. What's the mission there?
It's defined very succinctly. When the economic future, prevent military confrontation. The NSS recognizes that the Indo-Pacific accounts for almost half the world's GDP.
But they use a specific term, purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Right.
Why do that instead of just standard GDP?
It's a measure of realism. PPP accounts for what currencies can actually buy in their local economies. So the NSS is using it to say, look, the economic fight is even tougher than the dollar figures suggest. This is the biggest economic engine on Earth.
And if we don't dominate there,
we can't sustain being number one anywhere else.
And this leads to a pretty stinging self-critique of past U.S. policy on China. What was the big failed assumption?
The document is just blunt about it. The failure was assuming for decades that if we just gave China access to our markets, if we outsourced our manufacturing,
they become like us.
That they'd somehow integrate and liberalize into the rules-based international order.
But instead,
China got incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, and used that wealth for its own advantage, often at the expense of U.S. interests.
So the new strategy is all about a forced rebalancing, reciprocity, fairness, and it's tied to a very specific economic goal.
Yes, and this is where you see that ends and means connection become real. The goal is to grow the U.S. economy from roughly $30 trillion in 2025 up toward $40 trillion in the 2030s.
And that's not just a number for the economy's sake.
No, not at all. That sustained growth is presented as the absolute strategic foundation. It's what's necessary to maintain military deterrence and global preeminence. Without it, the whole strategy falls apart.
That context is so important. So what about the counter-strategy from Beijing? How is China adapting?
Well, China is pivoting its economic focus. The NSS highlights this intentional shift toward getting a stronger hold on supply chains in low and middle income countries.
Specifically, which ones?
The ones with a per capita GDP of $13,800 or less. And here's the data point that just, it jumps off the page.
They want.
China's exports to those low-income countries are now almost 4 times its exports to the United States.
4 times. So while the U.S. is trying to contain China economically, China is just expanding its market outward.
Creating new dependencies. And that brings the whole issue much closer to home.
Because if China is trying to dominate emerging markets,
then the Western Hemisphere becomes a critical, accessible area for them to operate, outside of direct U.S. naval power in the Pacific.
and beyond the geopolitics, the NSS also focuses on direct threats the U.S. wants to eliminate.
Right. The usual list is there. State-directed subsidies, unfair trade, IP theft on a massive scale.
But for you, the listener, focused on Latin America, there's a really visceral connection here.
Yes. The explicit goal of ending the export of fentanyl precursors from China. The document directly links China's chemical industry to the U.S. opioid crisis.
So it's not just a law enforcement problem anymore.
It's a core national security interest that requires hemispheric cooperation. It elevates the whole crisis to a strategic foreign policy mandate.
And to wrap this section up, it all comes back to deterrence, economic fuel for military capability.
Absolutely. The strategy calls for disciplined economic action to fund huge investments in cutting-edge tech.
AI, quantum computing, undersea space.
Exactly. That $40 trillion economy is the reservoir that funds the tech superiority you need to prevent a war in Asia.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly. The global battle is economic, it's focused in Asia, and it's fueled by American strength. But now let's zoom in on the Western Hemisphere, a region the NSS says has suffered from years of neglect.
And that neglect, it says, is over. It's being replaced by a concept that, frankly, hasn't been used this way for a very long time.
The Monroe Doctrine.
The reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, but redefined. The new central idea is what they call the Trump corollary.
That name alone is a very assertive political statement. So what does this Trump corollary actually mean? What's the signal?
The signal is zero tolerance for outside strategic encroachment. This corollary reasserts and enforces the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence. In practice, this means strategic denial. The U.S. will deny non-hemispheric competitors, China, Russia, whoever, the ability to position forces, and this is key,
Yes.
to own or control strategically vital assets in the region.
And what counts as a strategically vital asset? We're not just talking about military bases.
Well, it goes way beyond that. The NSS defines it as any asset that could give a foreign adversary leverage. So think deep-sea ports, major telecom infrastructure, especially 5G networks, or control over critical mineral sites.
So the core U.S. interests are pretty clear.
Very clear. Stop mass migration, cooperate against narco-terrorists and cartels, and secure supply chains and access to places like the Panama Canal.
And to do all this, the strategy boils it down to two actions: enlist and expand. Let's start with enlist. How does that work?
Enlist is all about economic incentives mixed with pressure. It means using commercial diplomacy tariffs, reciprocal trade, to aggressively push for the nearshoring of manufacturing.
So moving factories out of Asia and into our hemisphere.
Exactly. The goal is twofold. First, develop stable local economies. Second, reward the regional champions who actually help the U.S. with stability, stopping migration, and the drug flows.
And the military piece of this feels like maybe the biggest shift in the whole document.
It's a profound change. The strategy calls for a global military posture readjustment, specifically to deal with urgent threats right here in the Western Hemisphere.
And this isn't about foreign aid.
No, this is about targeted deployments to secure the U.S. border and, critically, to defeat the cartels.
The language is so unambiguous. It calls for using lethal force where necessary, and it replaces what it calls the failed law enforcement only strategy.
That phrase is a defining moment.
Yeah.
For decades, the U.S. treated cartels as a problem for, federal law enforcement and local police.
But this NSS elevates it.
It elevates the threat to a military one. It authorizes lethal force against narco-terrorist groups. The calculation is that these cartels now pose an existential threat that can't be contained by civilian means anymore.
That completely changes the game. Okay, so let's move to the expand strategy. Enlist is about manufacturing. Expand seems to be about resources.
Expand is all about becoming the uncontested partner of first choice. The U.S. knows the hemisphere is rich in lithium, copper, rare earth minerals.
All the things China also wants.
Exactly. So to counter China's moves, The NSS orders the National Security Council to immediately start a major interagency process
They're the goal of that process.
to identify strategic points and resources all across the region for joint development with partners. The U.S. isn't just seeking access.
It's seeking co-ownership.
Co-ownership and co-development to lock in the supply chains for all the critical components needed to fuel that $40 trillion economy we talked about.
So we've connected the global economic fight to the local demand for preeminence. The strategy calls allowing non-hemispheric competitors to gain inroads the Great American Strategic Mistake.
Hmm.
How does it propose to actually reverse that?
Well, the strategy is surprisingly pragmatic about this. It admits that some foreign influence, say, from governments that are politically aligned with adversaries, will be hard to reverse. But it notes that a lot of countries are just attracted to non-U.S. help because of the seemingly low costs and fewer hurdles.
Which means the U.S. countermove is to expose the fine print.
Precisely. The U.S. is going to accelerate efforts to show the true hidden costs that are embedded in that supposedly low-cost foreign aid.
And those hidden costs are?
Espionage risks, major cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and of course the debt traps that end up compromising a country's sovereignty.
And the U.S. plans to use its own unique global leverage to push back.
It will use its huge world-leading leverage in finance and technology, the dollar, control over software, to basically induce countries to reject that adversarial help.
So if China offers a bridge,
the U.S. offers the global banking system and the tech that runs the country's communications. That financial and tech weight is the hammer here.
and this is where the strategy gets really explicit about Mexico and how the trade war is showing up on the U.S. border.
Yes, this is a major part of the NSS's realism. It details how China, to get around U.S. tariffs, is now using middlemen and Chinese-built factories in a dozen countries,
Including Mexico.
to export goods indirectly to the U.S. So China is pushing its trade conflict right onto the U.S. doorstep, and it's exploiting regional trade deals to do it.
That turns a strategic neighbor like Mexico into a proxy battleground in the U.S.-China trade war.
Absolutely. The U.S. is now facing a situation where its own tariff policy is being undermined by its main competitor, using a country that the U.S. needs high levels of cooperation from on security and migration. The complexity is just immense.
So in the end, the NSS boils this all down to a pretty stark choice for these partner countries.
It's framed as this fundamental geopolitical decision. Do you want to live in an American-led world of sovereign countries and free economies, or one influenced by countries on the other side of the world?
The implication being that choosing the U.S. means genuine sovereignty, while choosing the other side means dependency.
That's the pitch.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the strictest requirement the NSS places on partnerships, especially where the U.S. has a lot of leverage, this idea of sole source contracts.
This is probably the most forceful expression of America First in the hemisphere. The strategy mandates resisting any targeted taxes or expropriation against U.S. businesses. But more importantly, it says the terms of agreements, especially for strategic resources or infrastructure, must be sole source contracts for U.S. companies.
Wait, demanding sole source contracts, isn't that just asking for diplomatic backlash? How do they justify that level of control?
The justification is strategic denial and a security guarantee. The NSS argues that if a country needs U.S. financial help, or if its stability depends on U.S. cooperation.
Like on defeating the cartels.
Exactly. Then U.S. leverage is high enough to insist that critical infrastructure ports, 5G pipelines, is only built by trusted U.S. firms. It's a very aggressive move to lock in U.S. economic advantage and block out Chinese bids entirely.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
The 2025 NSS is a foundational reorientation. It fundamentally links American economic dominance in Asia to strategic preeminence right here in the Western Hemisphere. And it uses that aggressive reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary, as its main tool.
So if we had to distill this new strategy, what are the three non-negotiables for the U.S. in the region?
First, a crystal clear focus on supply chain security and reindustrialization, which has to involve nearshoring manufacturing in allied nations like Mexico.
Wait a second.
The strategic denial of non-hemisphere competitors, mainly China, from owning or controlling any strategically vital asset in the region, period. And third, using that overwhelming U.S. financial and technological leverage to get U.S.-friendly trade terms, often enforced by that strict requirement for sole source contracts.
Which brings us right back to your original request, focusing on the biggest nations in the hemisphere. Mexico is specifically called out for proxy exports and border security. But these strategic mandates, enforcing the Trump corollary, insisting on sole source contracts, They apply broadly. The NSS tasks the NSC with identifying strategic resources across the entire region.
Yes, and that immediately shifts the focus to South America's giants.
Exactly. I mean, think about Brazil. It is crucial for regional balance, it is resource rich, and it already has deep commercial ties with China. It wasn't named in the proxy trade context like Mexico, but it's vital for that expand mandate for resource development. So here's the thought to leave you with. What practical incentives, beyond just pointing out the hidden risks of Chinese debt, are required for a huge sovereign nation like Brazil to choose the U.S. as its partner of first choice, especially when it's facing massive existing economic incentives from non-hemispheric competitors? That's the strategic puzzle this new NSS has to solve to succeed.